Hello, and I would like to welcome you to our daily readings of the Spirit of Prophecy, the great controversy between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angels, Volume 1, 1870, by Ellen G. White. We are now on Chapter 3. The reading entitled The Temptation and Fall. I'm reading from pages 27 to 44. But before I read to you this chapter, I would like to invite you for a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for another opportunity to hear this message of hope, the Spirit of Prophecy. Thank you for this temporal freedom given to us to use this platform to spread the message of hope. In the name of your dear Son, Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen. Amen. In the midst of the garden, near the tree of life, stood the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree was especially designed of God to be the pledge of their obedience, faith, and love to Him. Of this tree the Lord commanded our first parents not to eat, neither to touch it, lest they die. He told them that they might freely eat of all the trees in the garden except the one. But if they ate of that tree, they should surely die. When Adam and Eve were placed in the beautiful garden, they had everything for their happiness which they could desire. But He chose, in His all-wise arrangements, to test their loyalty before they could be rendered eternally secure. They were to have His favor, and He was to converse with them, and they with Him. Yet He did not place evil out of their reach. Satan was permitted to tempt them. If they endured the trial, they were to be in perpetual favor with God and the heavenly angels. Satan stood in amazement at his new condition. His happiness was gone. He looked upon the angels with him, were once so happy, but who had been expelled from heaven with him. Before their fall, not a shade of discontent had marred their perfect bliss. Now all seemed changed. Countenances which had reflected the image of their Maker were gloomy and despairing. Strife, discord, and bitter recrimination were among them. Previous to their rebellion, these things had been unknown in heaven. Satan now beholds the terrible results of his rebellion. He shuddered and feared to face the future and to contemplate the end of these things. The hour for joyful, happy songs of praise to God and His dear Son had come. Satan had led the heavenly choir. He had raised the first note. Then all the angelic hosts united with him, and glorious strains of music had resounded through heaven in honor of God and His dear Son. But now, instead of strains of sweetest music, discords and angry words fall upon the ear of the great rebel leader. Where was he? Was it not all a horrible dream? Was he shut out of heaven? Were the gates of heaven never more to open and admit him? The hour of worship draws nigh, when bright and holy angels bow before the Father. No more will he unite in heavenly song. No more will he bow in reverence and holy awe before the presence of the eternal God. Could he be again as he was when he was pure, true, and loyal? Gladly would he yield up the claims of his authority. But he was lost beyond redemption for his presumptuous rebellion. And this was not all. He had led others to rebellion and to the same condition with himself. Angels who had never thought to question the will of God, the will of heaven, or refuse obedience to the law of God, till he had put it into their minds, presenting before them that they might enjoy a greater good, a higher and more glorious liberty. This had been the sophistry whereby he had deceived them. A responsibility now rests upon him from which he would fain be released. These spirits had become turbulent with disappointed hopes. Instead of greater good, they were experiencing the sad results of disobedience and disregard of law. Nevermore will these unhappy beings be swayed by the mild rule of Jesus Christ. Nevermore will their spirits be steered by the deep, earnest love, peace, and joy which his presence had ever inspired in them to be returned to him in cheerful obedience and reverential honor. Satan trembled as he viewed his work. He was alone in meditation upon the past, the present, and his future plans. His mighty frame shook as with a tempest. An angel from heaven was passing. He called him and entreated an interview with Christ. This was granted him. He then related to the Son of God that he repented of his rebellion and wished again the favor of God. He was willing to take the place God had previously assigned him and be under his wise command. Christ wept at Satan's woe, but told him as the mind of God that he could never be received into heaven. Heaven must not be placed in jeopardy. All heaven would be marred with should he be received back, for sin and rebellion originated with him. The seeds of rebellion were still within him. He had in his rebellion no occasion for his course, and he had not only hopelessly ruined himself, but the host of the angels also, who would then have been happy in heaven had he remained steadfast. The law of God could condemn, but could not pardon. He repented not of his rebellion because he saw the goodness of God, which he had abused. It was not possible that his love for God had so increased since his fall that it would lead to cheerful submission and happy obedience to his law, which had been despised. The wretchedness he realized in losing the sweet light of heaven, and the sense of guilt which forced itself upon him, and the disappointment he experienced himself in not finding his expectations realized, were the cause of his grief. To be commander out of heaven was vastly different from being thus honored in heaven. The loss he had sustained of all the privileges of heaven seemed too much to be borne. He wished to regain this. This great change of position had not increased his love for God, nor for his wise and just law. When Satan became fully convinced that there was no possibility of his being reinstated in the favor of God, he manifested his malice with increased hatred and fiery vehemence. God knew that such determined rebellion would not remain inactive. Satan would invent means to annoy the heavenly angels and show contempt for his authority. As he could not gain admission within the gates of heaven, he would wait just at the entrance to taunt the angels and seek contention with them as they went in and out. He would seek to destroy the happiness of Adam and Eve. He would endeavor to incite them to rebellion, knowing that this would cause grief in heaven. His followers were seeking him, and he arose himself and, assuming a look of defiance, informed them of his plans to wrest from God the noble Adam and his companion Eve. If he could in any way beguile them to disobedience, God would make some provision whereby they might be pardoned, and then himself and all the fallen angels would be in a fair way to share with them of God's mercy. If this should fail, they could unite with Adam and Eve. For when once they should transgress the law of God, they would be subjects of God's wrath like themselves. Their transgression would place them also in a state of rebellion, and they could unite with Adam and Eve, take possession of Eden, and hold it as their home. And if they could gain access to the tree of life in the midst of the garden, their strength would, they thought, be equal to that of the holy angels, and even God himself could not expel them. Satan held a consultation with his evil angels. They did not at all readily unite to engage in this hazardous and terrible work. He told them that he would not entrust any one of them to accomplish this work, for he thought that he alone had wisdom sufficient to carry forward so important an enterprise. He wished them to consider the matter while he should leave them and seek retirement to mature his plans. He sought to impress upon them that this was their last and only hope. If they failed here, all prospect of regaining and controlling heaven or any part of God's creation was hopeless. Satan went alone to mature plans that would most surely secure the fall of Adam and Eve. He had fears that his purposes might be defeated. And again, even if he should be successful in leading Adam and Eve to disobey the commandment of God and thus become transgressor of his law, and no good come to himself, his own case would not be improved. His guilt would only be increased. He shuddered at the thought of plunging the wholly happy pair into the misery and remorse he was himself enduring. He seemed in a state of indecision, at one time firm and determined, then hesitating and wavering. His angels were seeking him, their leader, to acquaint him with their decision. They will unite with Satan in his plans, and with him, bear the responsibility and share the consequences. Satan cast off his feelings of despair and weakness, and as their leader, fortified himself to brave out the matter and do all in his power to defy the authority of God and his Son. He acquainted them with his plans. If he should come boldly upon Adam and Eve and make complaints of God's own Son, they would not listen to him for a moment, but would be prepared for such an attack. Should he seek to intimidate them because of the power so recently an angel in high authority, he could accomplish nothing. He decided that cunning and deceit would do what might or force could not. God assembled the angelic host to take measures to avert the threatened evil. It was decided in God's council for angels to visit at Eden and warn Adam that he was in danger from the foe. The holy pair received them with joyful to their Creator for thus surrounding them with such a profusion of his bounty. Everything lovely and attractive was theirs to enjoy, and everything seemed wisely adapted to their wants. And that which they prized above all other blessings was the society of the Son of God and the heavenly angels. For they had much to relate to them at every visit of their new discoveries of the beauties of nature in their lovely Eden home. And they had many questions to ask relative to many things which they could but indistinctly comprehend. The angels graciously and lovingly gave them the information they desired. They also gave them the sad history of Satan's rebellion and fall. They then distinctly informed them that the tree of knowledge was placed in the garden to be a pledge of their obedience and love to God, that the high and happy estate of the holy angels was to be retained upon condition of obedience, that they were similarly situated, that they could obey the law of God and be inexpressibly happy, or disobey and lose their high estate and be plunged into despair, hopeless despair. They told Adam and Eve that God would not compel them to obey, that he had not removed from them power to go contrary to his will, that they were moral agents free to obey or disobey. There was but one prohibition that God had seen fit to lay upon them as yet. If they should transgress the will of God, they would surely die. They told Adam and Eve that the most exalted angel next in order to have Christ refused obedience to the law of God, which he had ordained to govern heavenly beings. that this rebellion had caused war in heaven, which resulted in the rebellious being expelled therefrom, and every angel was driven out of heaven who united with him in questioning the authority, the great Jehovah. And that this fallen foe was now an enemy to all that concerned the interest of God and his dear Son. They told them that Satan purposed to do them harm, and it was necessary for them to be guarded, for they might come in contact with the fallen foe, but he could not harm them while they yielded obedience to God's command. For if necessary, every angel from heaven would come to their help rather than he should in any way do them harm. But if they disobeyed the command of God, then Satan would have power to ever annoy, perplex, and trouble them. If they remained steadfast against the first insinuations of Satan, they were as secure as the heavenly angels. But if they yielded to the tempter, he who spared not the exalted angels would not spare them. They must suffer the penalty of their transgression. For the law of God was as sacred as himself, and he required implicit obedience from all in heaven and on earth. The angels cautioned Eve not to separate from her husband in her employment, for she might be brought in contact with this fallen foe. If separated from each other, they would be in greater danger than if both were together. The angels charged them to closely follow the instructions God had given them in reference to the tree of knowledge. For in perfect obedience they were safe, and this fallen foe could then have no power to deceive them. God would not permit Satan to follow the holy pair with continual temptations. He could have access to them only at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve assured the angels that they should never transgress the express command of God, for it was their highest pleasure to do his will. The angels united with Adam and Eve in holy strains of harmonious music, and as their songs pealed forth from blissful Eden, Satan heard the sound of their strains of joyful adoration to the Father and Son. And as Satan heard it, his envy, hatred, and malignity increased, and he expressed his anxiety to his followers to incite them. Adam and Eve's disobedience once bring the wrath of God upon them, and change their songs of praise to hatred and curses to their Maker. Satan assumes the form of a serpent and enters Eden. The serpent was a beautiful creature with wings, and while flying through the air, his appearance was bright, resembling burnished gold. He did not go upon the ground, but went from place to place through the air and ate fruit like man. Satan entered the serpent and took his position in the tree of knowledge and commenced leisurely eating of the fruit. Eve, unconsciously at first separated from her husband in her employment. When she became aware of the fact, she felt that there might be danger, but again she thought herself secure. Even if she did not remain close by the side of her husband, she had wisdom and strength to know if evil came and to meet it. This the angels had cautioned her not to do. Eve found herself gazing with mingled curiosity and admiration upon the fruit of the forbidden tree. She saw it was very lovely and was reasoning with herself why God had so decisively prohibited their eating or touching it. Now was Satan's opportunity. He addressed her as though he was able to divine her thoughts. "Yeah, hath God said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Thus with soft and pleasant words and with musical voice he addressed the wondering Eve. She was startled to hear a serpent speak. He extolled her beauty and exceeding loveliness, which was not displeasing to Eve. But she was amazed, for she knew that to the serpent God had not given the power of speech. Eve's curiosity was aroused, Instead of fleeing from the spot, she listened to hear a serpent talk. It did not occur to her mind that it might be that fallen foe using the serpent as a medium. It was Satan that spoke, not the serpent. Eve was beguiled, flattered, infatuated. Had she met a commanding personage possessing a form like the angels and resembling them, she would have been upon her guard. But that strange voice should have driven her to her husband's side to inquire of him why another should thus freely address her. But she enters into a controversy with the serpent. She answers his question. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, you shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. The serpent answers, you shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Satan would convey the idea that by eating of the forbidden tree, they would receive a new and more novel kind of knowledge than they had hitherto attained. This has been his special work with great success ever since his fall, to lead man to pray into the secrets of the Almighty and not to be satisfied with what God has revealed and not careful to obey that which he has commanded. He would lead them to disobey God's commands and then make them believe that they are entering a wonderful field of knowledge. This is purely supposition and a miserable deception. They fail to understand what God has revealed and disregard his explicit commands and aspire after wisdom independent of God and seek to withhold that which he has seen, he has been pleased to withhold from mortals. They are elated with their ideas of progression and charmed with their own vain philosophy, but grope in midnight darkness relative to true knowledge. They are ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. It was not the will of God that this sinless pair should have any knowledge of evil. He had freely given them the good, but withheld the evil. Eve thought the words of the serpent wise, and she received the broad assertion, ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, making God a liar. Satan boldly insinuates that God had deceived them to keep them from being exalted in knowledge equal with himself. God said, if you eat, ye shall surely die. The serpent said, if you eat, ye shall not surely die. The tempter assured Eve that as soon as she ate of the fruit, she would receive a new and superior knowledge that would make her equal with God. He called her attention to himself. He ate freely of the tree and found it not only perfectly harmless, but delicious and exhilarating, and told her that it was because of its wonderful properties to impart wisdom and power that God had prohibited them from tasting or even touching it. For he knew its wonderful qualities. He stated that by eating of the fruit of the tree forbidden them was the reason he had attained the power of speech. He intimidated that God would not carry out his word. It was merely a threat to intimidate them and keep them from great good. He further told them that they could not die had they not eaten of the tree of life, which perpetuates immortality. He said that God was deceiving them to keep them from a higher state of felicity and more exalted happiness. The tempter plucked the fruit and passed it to Eve. She took it in her hand. Now said the tempter, you were prohibited from even touching it, lest you die. He told her that she would realize no more sense of evil and death in eating than in touching or handling the fruit. Eve was emboldened because she felt not the immediate signs of God's displeasure. She thought the words of the tempter all wise and correct. She ate and was delighted with the fruit. It seemed delicious to her taste, and she imagined that she realized in herself the wonderful effects of the fruit. She then plucked for herself of the fruit and ate, and imagined she felt the quickening power of a new and elevated existence as the result of the exhilarating influence of the forbidden fruit. She was in a strange and unnatural excitement as she sought her husband, with her hands filled with the forbidden fruit. She related to him the wise discourse of the serpent and wished to conduct him at once to the tree of knowledge. She told him she had eaten of the fruit, and instead of her feeling any sense of death, she realized a pleasing, exhilarating influence. As soon as Eve had disobeyed, she became a powerful medium through which to occasion the fall of her husband. I saw sadness came over the countenance of Adam. He appeared afraid and astonished. A struggle appeared to be going on in his mind. He told Eve he was quite certain that this was the foe that they had been warned against, and if so, that she must die. She assured him she felt no ill effects, but rather a very pleasant influence, and entreated him to eat. Adam quite well understood that his companion had transgressed the only provision laid upon them as a test of their fidelity and love. Eve reasoned that the serpent said they should not surely die, and his words must be true, for she felt no signs of God's displeasure, but the pleasant influence, as she imagined the angels felt. Adam regretted that Eve had left his side, but now that the deed was done, he must be separated from her, whose society he had loved so well. How could he hide it thus? His love for Eve was strong, and in utter discouragement, he resolved to share her fate. He reasoned that Eve was a part of himself, and if she must die, he would die with her, for he could not bear the thought of separation from her. He lacked faith in his merciful and benevolent Creator. He did not think that God, who had formed him out of the dust of the ground into a living, beautiful form, had created Eve to be his companion, could supply her place. After all, might not the words of this white serpent be correct? Eve was before him just as lovely and beautiful, and apparently as innocent as before this act of disobedience. She expressed greater, higher love for him than before her of disobedience. She expressed greater, higher love for him than before her disobedience. As the effects of the fruit she had eaten, he saw in her no signs of death. She told him of the happy influence of the fruit, of her ardent love for him, and he decided to brave the consequences. He seized the fruit and quickly ate it, and like Eve, felt not immediately its ill effects. Eve had thought herself capable of deciding between right and wrong. The flattering hope of entering a higher state of knowledge had led her to think that the serpent was her especial friend, possessing a great interest in her welfare. Had she sought her husband, had they had related to their maker the words of the serpent, they would have been delivered at once from his artful deception. God instructed our first parents in regard to the tree of knowledge, and they were fully informed related to the fall of Satan and the danger of listening to his suggestions. He did not deprive them of the power of eating the forbidden fruit. He left them as free moral agents to believe his word, obey his commandments, and live or believe the tempter, disobey and perish. They both ate, and the great wisdom they obtained was the knowledge of sin and a sense of guilt. The covering of light about them soon disappeared, and under a sense of guilt and loss of their divine covering, a shivering seized them, and they tried to cover their exposed forms. The Lord would not have them investigate the fruit of the tree of knowledge, for then they would be exposed to Satan's mask. He knew that they would be perfectly safe if they touched not the fruit. Our first parents chose to believe the words as they thought of a serpent, yet he had given them no tokens of his love. He had done nothing for their happiness and benefit, while God had given them everything that was good for food and pleasant to the sight. Everywhere the eye might rest was abundance and beauty, yet Eve was deceived by the serpent to think that there was something withheld which would make them wise, even as God. Instead of believing and confiding in God, she basely distrusted his goodness and cherished the words of Satan. After Adam's transgression, he at first imagined that he felt the rising to a new and higher existence. But soon the thought of his transgression terrified him. The air that had been of a mild and even temperature seemed to chill them. The guilty pair had a sense of sin. They felt a dread of the future, a sense of want, a nakedness of soul. The sweet love and peaceful and happy contented bliss seemed removed from them, and in its place a want of something came over them that they never experienced before. They then for the first turned their attention to the external. They had not been clothed, but were draped in light, as were the heavenly angels. This light had enshrouded them departed, which had enshrouded them departed, to realize the sense of lack and nakedness, which they realized. Their attention was directed to seek a covering for their forms, for how they could not meet the eye of God and angels and cloth. Their crime is now before them in its true light. Their transgression of God's express command assumes a clearer character. Adam censured Eve's folly in leaving his side and being deceived by the serpent. They both flattered themselves that God, who had given them everything to make them happy, might yet excuse their disobedience because of his great love to them, and that their punishment would not be so dreadful after all. Satan exulted in his success. He had now tempted the woman to distrust God, to question his wisdom, and to seek to penetrate his all-wise plans. And through her, he had also caused the overthrow of Adam, who, in consequence of his love for Eve, disobeyed the command of God and fell with her. The news of man's fall spread through heaven. Every harp was hushed. The angels cast their crowns from their heads in sorrow. All heaven was in agitation. The angels were grieved at the base ingratitude of man in return for the rich bounties God had provided. A council was held to decide what must be done with the guilty pair. The angels feared that they would put forth the hand and eat of the tree of life and thus perpetuate a life of sin. The Lord visited Adam and Eve and made known to them the consequences of their disobedience. As they hear God's majestic approach, they seek to hide themselves from his inspection, whom they delighted. While in their innocence and holiness to meet, and the Lord God called upon unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I have heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the fruit thereof? I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat. This question was asked by the Lord, not because he needed information, but for the conviction of the guilty pair. How didst thou become ashamed and fearful? Adam acknowledged his transgression, not because he was penitent for his great disobedience, but to cast reflection upon God. The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the fruit, and I did eat. The woman was then addressed, What is this that thou hast done? Eve answered, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. The Lord then addressed the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field, and upon thy belly shalt thou go, and thus shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. As the serpent had been exalted above the beasts of the field, he should be degraded beneath them all. And he detested by man, inasmuch as he was the medium through which Satan acted. And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened to the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweet of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return unto the ground. God cursed the ground because of their sin in eating of the tree of knowledge, and declared, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. He had apportioned them the good, but withheld the evil. Now God declares that they shall eat of it. That is, they should be acquainted with evil all the days of their life. The race from that time forward was to be afflicted by Satan's temptations. A life of perpetual toil and anxiety was appointed unto Adam. Instead of the happy, cheerful labor he had hitherto enjoyed, they should be subject to disappointment, grief, and pain, and finally come to dissolution. They were made of the dust of the earth, and unto dust should they return. They were informed that they would have to lose their Eden homes. They had yielded to Satan's deception and believed the word of Satan that God would lie. By their transgression, and opened a way for Satan to gain access to them more readily. And it was not safe for them to remain in the Garden of Eden, lest in their state of sin, they gain access to the tree of life and perpetuate a life of sin. They entreated to be permitted to remain, although they acknowledged that they had forfeited all right to blissful Eden. They promised that they would in the future yield to God implicit obedience. They were informed that in their fall from innocence to guilt, they gained no strength but great weakness. They had not preserved their integrity while they were in a state of holy, happy innocence. And they would have far less strength to remain true and loyal in a state of conscious guilt. They were filled with keenest anguish and remorse. They now realized that the penalty of sin was death. Angels were commissioned to immediately guard the way of the tree of life. It was Satan's studied plan that Adam and Eve should disobey God, receive his frown, and then partake of the tree of life, that they might perpetuate a life of sin. But holy angels were sent to debar their way to the tree of life. Around this, angels flashed beams of light on every side, which had the appearance of glittering swords. May God continue